7 years ago, a powerful billionaire cast out the woman he loved, calling her a disgrace. Now, at a glittering charity ball, she walks in wearing black, hand in hand with a little girl who has his piercing blue eyes. Aaron Blackwell sat in his office, a room lined with polished mahogany shelves and vast windows that overlooked the glittering skyline of Manhattan. The city stretched out beneath him, alive with movement, yet distant, as though it belonged to another world, one far away from the silent fortress of wealth and power he had built around himself. His desk was crowded with papers he did not intend to read, contracts he would delegate to his lawyers, and invitations for the charity ball that had become a tradition more for his reputation than for his heart. He leaned back in the leather chair, his hand brushing through his dark hair, and let his cold blue eyes fall upon the stack of names before him. Each guest was carefully chosen, each one significant in some political, financial, or social way. This night was not about generosity, it was about dominance, about reminding New York's elite that Aaron Blackwell remained untouchable. The secretary hovered near the desk, carefully sliding another folder across the polished surface. "The final guest list, sir," she said softly, as though afraid to disturb the calm. Aaron barely glanced at it at first, his mind already ahead, picturing the evening, the music, the lights, the endless sea of admiring faces. Then his gaze stopped. His expression shifted so slightly that only someone who had known him well could have noticed. One name, written in elegant black ink, pulled him back into a past he thought he had erased. Emily Brown. For a moment, he almost thought it was a mistake. Her name did not belong here, not among governors, foreign investors, and the heads of powerful dynasties. Yet there it was, unassuming but sharp as a blade, cutting through his carefully controlled composure. His jaw tightened, though his lips curved in what might have passed as a smile to the untrained eye. "Send it," he said after a long pause. His voice was casual, almost amused, but deep inside something stirred, something he refused to acknowledge. "Let her come. Let her see what life looks like when you're no longer part of it." The secretary nodded quickly, scribbling a note, unaware of the storm those two words had released. Aaron reached for his glass of scotch and took a long sip, letting the burn anchor him in the present. He convinced himself it was nothing more than a fleeting whim, a careless indulgence. He wanted to see her again not because she mattered, no, she had not mattered for a long time, but because it amused him to imagine the look on her face. 7 years had passed, and she would see who he had become, a man carved of ice, untouchable, a symbol of power and success. The boy who once hesitated and faltered had died the moment he walked away from her. Now he was unbreakable. And yet, as the skyline shimmered in the fading light of evening, a shadow lingered in his thoughts, as unwelcome as it was unshakable. For the first time in years, Aaron Blackwell felt the past reaching for him, and no amount of money, glass towers, or carefully crafted walls could stop it. Emily sat at the small kitchen table in her modest apartment, her hands trembling as they rested on the heavy envelope lying before her. The paper was thick, expensive, black with a golden crest embossed at its center, the kind of invitation that belonged to a world she had long ago abandoned. For several minutes she could not bring herself to open it, though she already knew who had sent it. The name written in sharp, commanding letters across the envelope's back was burned into her memory. She slid her fingers under the seal, tearing it open with a hesitation that felt like fear, and pulled out the folded card. Inside, in elegant calligraphy, was the invitation to the Blackwell Foundation charity ball. Her breath caught in her chest. She had not expected him to ever remember she existed, much less to summon her into his gilded world once again. The moment she saw his name printed at the bottom, memories surged through her like an old wound ripped open. It had been 7 years since she had last seen Aaron Blackwell, 7 years since he had looked at her with those icy blue eyes and cut her down with words that could never be taken back. She remembered standing in his penthouse apartment, the city lights glittering outside like a million distant stars, while her hands pressed nervously over the life growing inside her. She had been terrified but hopeful, clinging to the belief that the man she loved would embrace the child they had created together. Instead, his face had hardened, his voice had turned to steel, and his judgment fell on her like a sentence. "You're a disgrace," he had said, cold and final, before turning his back and leaving her to drown in silence. That night had never left her. She had walked away carrying not only his child but also the unbearable weight of betrayal. The following months had been a blur of struggle, working 2 jobs, hiding her pain from those who would not understand, and fighting through the loneliness of nights when her body ached and her heart longed for comfort that never came. Every time she felt her baby move, she had promised herself that she would never allow bitterness to poison the love she owed her child. But she could not forget the way Aaron had abandoned her when she needed him most. Her eyes blurred as she stared at the invitation. She thought about the glittering chandeliers, the luxurious gowns, the world of money and power that Aaron had claimed as his own. That world had once seemed within her reach, but when he cast her out, it became a locked door she never wanted to open again. And now, for reasons she could not comprehend, he had sent her an invitation to return. Was it a cruel joke, a test of her pride, or some twisted desire to remind her of what she had lost? She could not be certain, but the effect was the same. Her chest ached, her hands shook, and the room around her seemed smaller, filled with the shadows of the past. She rose from the table and walked to the bedroom where her daughter was playing quietly with her dolls. Lily looked up, her wide brown eyes glowing with innocence, her laughter carrying a purity Emily often envied. In her daughter's face she saw both her salvation and her torment, for those striking blue eyes, so out of place beneath her brown hair, were a constant reminder of the man who had given her life and broken her mother's. Emily leaned against the doorway, watching the little girl arrange her dolls into a neat row, and for a moment the invitation in her hand felt heavier than iron. She had never told Lily about her father, had never spoken his name. To her daughter, family was just the 2 of them, bound together by love and survival. But as Emily stood there, torn between past and present, she felt the faint stirrings of a storm that could no longer be avoided. The envelope lay open on the table behind her, its golden crest catching the dim light of the apartment. Emily closed her eyes, remembering his voice, his contempt, his abandonment, and the way he had walked away without a second glance. She had rebuilt herself from those ashes, but scars remained, scars that deepened when she saw his name. She knew the invitation was not an olive branch. It was a reminder of what he thought he had taken from her. Yet as she looked again at Lily, radiant and untainted, Emily felt something harden within her chest. Whatever Aaron Blackwell's intentions were, she would not cower. She had survived without him, raised a daughter without his help, and though the pain of the past still haunted her, she was no longer the broken girl he had left behind. Still, that night, long after Lily had fallen asleep, Emily sat alone with the card clutched in her hand, staring at the letters that seemed to burn into her soul. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to whisper his name into the silence, and with it came a wave of emotions she had tried so hard to bury. Pain, anger, sorrow, but also something more dangerous, curiosity. After 7 years, Aaron Blackwell had summoned her back into his world, and whether she wanted it or not, part of her longed to see the man he had become. The invitation lay on the counter for days, unopened after that first night, though Emily had already read it so many times she could recite every gilded letter in her mind. She tried to ignore it, to bury herself in her routine of early mornings, long hours at the cafe, and the tender moments she shared with her daughter before bed. Yet no matter how many times she told herself it was nothing, a cruel jest meant to unsettle her, she felt its presence in the apartment like an uninvited guest. Every time she walked past the counter, her eyes would drift toward the black envelope, and her chest would tighten with the question she didn't want to face: should she go? She hated herself for even considering it, but the thought would not leave her. It was not curiosity alone that pulled her, but something deeper, something she refused to name. Lily was the reason she hesitated. Her daughter was 6 years old, bright and full of questions, with an innocence Emily both cherished and feared to lose. The little girl had never asked about her father, though Emily often wondered how much she suspected. Lily had a way of looking at people, of noticing details beyond her years, and Emily sometimes caught her staring into the mirror with a puzzled expression, as though comparing her own features to her mother's. There was a quiet awareness in her, an understanding that their family was different from the families of her classmates, even if she never spoke of it. Emily dreaded the day when she would have to answer questions she had avoided for so long. It was on a rainy afternoon that the decision began to take shape. Emily had returned home soaked and exhausted, her shoes squeaking against the worn wooden floor. She found Lily sitting at the kitchen table, the envelope in her small hands, studying the golden crest with fascination. "It's so pretty," Lily said, her eyes wide as she traced the raised letters with her finger. "Is it for us?" Emily froze, caught between truth and deflection, her heart hammering in her chest. For a long moment she could not speak, but Lily's expectant gaze forced her to swallow her fear. She managed a soft smile and took the invitation from her. "It's for an event," she said carefully. "A fancy party." Lily's face lit up with excitement. "A party? Can we go? I've never been to one like that." Emily sat down beside her daughter, the weight of the question pressing down harder than she could bear. She wanted to say no, to tell her that such places were not meant for them, that the glittering world of ballrooms and chandeliers belonged to others. But when she looked at Lily's eager face, glowing with the kind of hope only a child could hold, something shifted inside her. She realized that her decision was no longer about Aaron or the pain he had caused. It was about her daughter, about the chance to give Lily a memory that was not tainted by secrets or fear. For once, Emily wanted her child to step into a room and feel that she belonged, even if only for a night. That evening, after Lily had gone to bed, Emily sat in the quiet apartment and stared at the invitation once more. She thought of the humiliation she had suffered 7 years ago, of the man who had cast her aside and left her to face motherhood alone. She thought of the long nights when she had cried into her pillow, the endless shifts she had worked to provide for her daughter, the times she had almost broken under the weight of it all. And then she thought of Lily, her laughter, her boundless energy, her uncanny blue eyes. Emily realized she had spent years hiding, protecting herself by keeping the past at bay. But hiding had cost her something too. It had left shadows in her heart that she had never allowed to lift. A fierce resolve began to take root. If Aaron Blackwell had invited her as some kind of cruel jest, then he would see that she was no longer the girl he could break. She would not go to the ball as a victim of his arrogance but as a woman who had rebuilt her life from ashes. And she would not go alone. She would walk into that room with her daughter at her side, and the world he had tried to deny would stand before him in flesh and blood. For the first time in years, Emily felt a strange, dangerous thrill, a determination to face what she had spent so long running from. When she finally folded the invitation and set it back on the table, her hands were steady. The decision was made, though fear lingered like a whisper in the corners of her mind. She knew the night would not be easy. It might open old wounds, it might unleash storms she could not control, but she would not turn away. Her daughter deserved the truth, and Emily deserved the strength to confront the man who had once condemned her. The past had followed her for too long, now it was time to meet it head-on. The night of the charity ball arrived with the kind of grandeur only wealth could buy. The ballroom of the Blackwell Foundation Tower gleamed under crystal chandeliers, their light scattering across polished marble floors and mirrored walls, turning the entire room into a dazzling spectacle. Waiters in immaculate uniforms carried trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres, weaving between guests dressed in gowns and tuxedos worth more than most families earned in a year. A string quartet played softly in the background, their music mingling with the low hum of conversation and laughter. Every corner of the room seemed to sparkle, a testament to power and excess. At the center of it all stood Aaron Blackwell, the orchestrator of the evening, his presence commanding as always. He wore his confidence like armor, shaking hands with politicians, exchanging jokes with investors, and letting the cameras capture his carefully crafted image. He appeared untouchable, polished, and self-assured, a man who had conquered every obstacle and bent the world to his will. Yet beneath the practiced smile and steady gaze, a part of him was restless. He told himself it was nothing, only the strain of hosting such an event, but there was a flicker of anticipation he could not quite suppress. Somewhere in the back of his mind, he remembered the name he had ordered placed on the guest list, the woman whose presence would mean little to anyone else but everything to him. He had not truly believed she would come. It had been a reckless whim, an indulgence he had masked as amusement, but now that the night was in full bloom, he found himself glancing toward the entrance more often than he cared to admit. The grand doors of the ballroom opened once more, and conversation faltered as though the air itself shifted. Heads turned, whispers rippled, and even the music seemed to pause for a breath. Emily Brown stepped into the room. She wore a gown of deep black that clung to her slender figure and flowed elegantly to the floor, simple yet arresting, commanding attention without ornament or excess. Her brown hair fell in waves across her shoulders, her chin lifted with quiet defiance, her dark eyes holding steady as though she knew the entire room was watching. But it was not only her presence that silenced the crowd. At her side walked a little girl in a rose-colored dress, her small hand clasped firmly in her mother's. The child's brown hair caught the light, soft curls brushing her cheeks, and when she lifted her face to the brilliance of the room, her blue eyes shone like shards of ice. Aaron's glass froze halfway to his lips. The sight struck him with such force that for the first time in years, his composure wavered. He could not breathe, could not move, as recognition seared through him. The girl was perhaps 6 years old, her step small but confident as she clung to her mother's hand. He felt the walls of the ballroom close in around him, the laughter of his companions fading into nothing, until all he could see was the child's unmistakable gaze staring back at him. Blue eyes. His eyes. Emily did not falter. She walked into the room with dignity, her posture unbending, her presence unashamed. She did not cower under the stares of the wealthy, nor did she shrink when she saw him across the room. Instead, her gaze locked onto Aaron with a calmness that unsettled him far more than anger would have. There was no plea in her expression, no softness, only a quiet strength forged in the years he had not been there to witness. She moved through the crowd with her daughter at her side, and for the first time in his life, Aaron Blackwell felt something he had never allowed himself to feel in public: fear. The guests began to murmur, some recognizing Emily, others piecing together the startling resemblance between the child and the host of the evening. Aaron could hear none of it. His mind was consumed by the sight of the girl, by the realization that his past had not simply returned to haunt him, it had walked boldly into his world, alive and undeniable. He remembered the choice he had made 7 years ago, the cruelty of his words, the coldness of his rejection, and for a moment the polished facade of his empire cracked. His pulse raced, his throat tightened, and the man who had once prided himself on being untouchable suddenly found himself stripped bare before a room full of onlookers. Emily paused only long enough to let the silence settle around them, as if daring him to look away. And when she finally stopped at the edge of the crowd, her daughter's small hand still resting securely in her own, the faintest curve touched her lips, not a smile, not triumph, but a gesture that told him everything. She was no longer the girl he had abandoned. She was a woman who had survived him. And now she had returned, not alone, but with the living proof of his greatest failure standing beside her. Aaron could not hear the music resume, nor the conversations rekindle. For him, the ballroom had become unbearably small, filled only with the weight of his past, the quiet dignity of the woman he had lost, and the piercing gaze of a child he had never known. Aaron stood rooted to the polished marble floor as though the weight of his own body had suddenly doubled. His fingers loosened around the crystal glass he had been holding, and he barely managed to set it on a nearby table before it slipped from his grasp. The room around him continued to hum with life, but in his ears there was only a sharp ringing, as if the world had narrowed to a single point. That point was the small girl at Emily's side. He tried to convince himself that he was mistaken, that the resemblance was some cruel trick of his imagination, but denial dissolved the moment the child's eyes lifted toward him. Blue, unyielding, and achingly familiar, they mirrored his own reflection with such startling clarity that it felt like a blow to his chest. The girl's gaze was innocent, curious, untouched by the shadows of the past. She looked at him as a stranger, yet something deeper stirred in her expression, a faint recognition that unsettled him. Aaron's heart thudded with an intensity he had not felt in years. He could see his mother's eyes in hers, the same pale shade that had been passed down to him, the same shade that no one else in Emily's family could have given her. The truth was written there, undeniable and merciless, a truth he had run from long ago and now faced under the scrutiny of 100 watching eyes. He felt heat rising to his face, not from shame alone but from the flood of memory that came crashing back. He remembered Emily standing in his penthouse, trembling yet hopeful, her voice breaking as she told him she was carrying his child. He remembered the way he had looked at her with contempt, choosing his pride over his humanity, choosing cruelty over love. The word he had used, disgrace, echoed now like poison in his mind. At the time he had convinced himself he was doing the right thing, protecting his empire, avoiding weakness. But now, staring at the living consequence of that choice, he saw his cowardice for what it was. He had abandoned them. He had abandoned her. Around him, whispers spread. The resemblance had not gone unnoticed by the crowd. Men and women in glittering attire glanced from him to the child, exchanging knowing looks and hushed words. He could feel their judgment like knives in his back, the irony that the great Aaron Blackwell, who had always prided himself on control, had just lost it in the most public of ways. Yet he hardly cared about them. All that mattered in that moment was Emily, standing with her chin high, her expression calm but edged with steel. She was not afraid, not humiliated as he once believed she would be if forced into his world. Instead, she radiated a quiet power that humbled him more than the scorn of the entire room. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a moment time seemed to suspend. He searched her face for anger, for hatred, for some sign that she wanted to see him broken as punishment for his betrayal. But what he saw was worse. There was no trace of desperation, no flicker of yearning. She looked at him as though he were a stranger, a man who had forfeited every right to stand in her life. Her strength unsettled him because it revealed how deeply she had survived without him. She had raised that child alone, carried the burden he had cast aside, and now she stood in the heart of his empire without flinching. Aaron's throat tightened painfully, and he forced himself to draw a breath. He wanted to speak, to call her name, but the words refused to form. Instead, he could only stare as the enormity of the truth settled in his bones. That little girl was his daughter. He had missed her first steps, her first words, her laughter, and her tears. He had not been there to hold her when she was sick or to celebrate her birthdays. 7 years of her life had unfolded without him, and in those years he had lived as if nothing was missing. Now, seeing her beside Emily, radiant and alive, he felt the crushing weight of all that he had lost. The moment stretched unbearably. Emily's lips curved slightly, but it was not a smile. It was a quiet acknowledgement, a message that needed no words. She knew he understood now, and she would not hide what he had tried to erase. The proof of his failure stood beside her, breathing, laughing, alive, and he could do nothing to deny it. For the first time in years, Aaron Blackwell felt powerless, stripped of his armor of wealth and pride, and left exposed before the very woman he had once condemned. The music swelled again, and the spell of silence broke. Conversations resumed around them, though Aaron knew the whispers would continue long after. Yet in that sea of glittering gowns and polished shoes, he felt as though there were only 3 people in the world: himself, Emily, and the child whose eyes mirrored his own. Aaron's world blurred around the edges as he pushed through the circle of polished men and jeweled women who tried to draw him back into their conversations. Their voices seemed distant, muffled by the pounding of his own pulse, every step carrying him closer to the woman and child who had turned his life into a mirror he could no longer ignore. The room was vast, but crossing it felt like wading through heavy water, each stride weighted with the knowledge of 7 years of silence. The closer he came, the more he realized that there was no turning back. Whatever words were spoken next would alter his life forever. Emily stood still, her hand resting protectively on the small shoulder beside her, her posture unbending despite the dozens of eyes watching the scene unfold. She had expected him to come. The calmness in her face was not born of peace but of preparation, as if she had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. When Aaron stopped before her, silence rippled outward once again, the guests sensing the gravity of the encounter, some feigning distraction while leaning in to catch every word. "Emily," he said, her name catching in his throat, softer than he intended, stripped of the authority that usually laced his voice. He glanced down at the child and then back at her mother, the question trembling on his lips though he already knew the answer. "Is she?" Emily's eyes did not waver. There was no hesitation, no attempt to soften the truth for his sake. "She is your daughter," she replied, her tone even, sharp with the strength she had earned. "Her name is Lily." The sound of the name was like a key turning in a lock deep inside him. Lily. A name he had not chosen, a name he had not spoken, a name that had belonged entirely to Emily until this moment. He looked at the girl again, truly looked, and something inside him cracked. She was staring up at him, curious, her expression a mixture of shyness and wonder, and he felt the strange, disorienting pull of recognition. His chest tightened with guilt so raw it nearly stole his breath. The guests shifted uncomfortably, their whispers swelling, but Aaron ignored them. "Emily," he began, struggling to find words that could bridge the canyon between them. I didn't know. You knew," she cut him off, her voice quiet but laced with steel. "You knew there was a child. You chose not to care." Her words sliced through him with the precision of a blade, because they were true. No denial could erase what he had done. Aaron felt a tremor in his hands and forced them to remain at his sides, unwilling to reach for her when he had no right. "I was a coward," he admitted, the words raw and unpolished, spilling into the space between them. "I told myself I was protecting what I had built, but I was only protecting myself. I was too weak to face it, too selfish to see what I was losing." Emily's expression remained unreadable, though her eyes flickered with something he could not quite name, pain, perhaps, or the echo of the girl she once had been. She held Lily closer, not in fear but in defiance, as though to remind him that this child belonged first to her, that she had carried every burden he had abandoned. "And now?" she asked, her voice steady. "Now you see her, and suddenly you regret? Do you think regret changes the years she lived without a father? Do you think regret changes the nights I spent praying I would be strong enough for both of us?" Her words struck him harder than any blow could have, yet he did not look away. "No," he said hoarsely. "It doesn't change it. Nothing I say or do can give back what I took. But please, Emily, let me try now. Let me at least know her. Let me prove that I can be more than the man who walked away." For the first time, Emily's composure wavered. Her eyes softened slightly, not out of forgiveness, but because she could not shield herself from the sight of his sincerity. He had always been powerful, always controlled, but now he stood before her stripped of every defense, trembling in the presence of the truth he could no longer deny. Lily tugged gently on her mother's hand and whispered, "Mama, who is he?" The question silenced the entire room once more, though spoken only in the sweet, unguarded tone of a child. Emily's throat tightened, her heart torn between fear and inevitability. She looked down at her daughter and then back at the man who had once broken her completely. Aaron's eyes filled with something she had never seen in him before, something that went beyond regret, something closer to desperation, even love. He dropped his voice to a whisper meant only for Emily, though the weight of it carried far beyond. "Please, don't shut me out. Not from her. Not from you." Emily inhaled slowly, steadying herself against the storm of emotions threatening to pull her under. She did not answer him immediately, because answers came too easily, and nothing about this moment deserved simplicity. She met his gaze head-on, her silence louder than any verdict, and Aaron understood that his fate was no longer in his own hands. For the first time in his life, control belonged to someone else entirely. The ballroom's glitter had dulled into a blur of meaningless light by the time Aaron found Emily again. She had retreated into one of the quieter corridors that stretched away from the grand hall, her daughter safely taken to another room with a kind attendant who had offered to watch her for a while. The music and laughter behind them were muffled now, replaced by the soft echo of footsteps on marble and the steady hum of silence that seemed almost unbearable. Emily stood near a tall window, her arms crossed as she looked out at the city, the reflection of her face in the glass stern and unyielding. When Aaron approached, his steps hesitant, she did not turn to acknowledge him. She had expected him to follow, and she had already steeled herself for whatever words he might say. He stopped several feet behind her, suddenly unsure of how to begin. The man who commanded boardrooms, who bent politicians and investors to his will with a glance, found himself trembling like a boy stripped of every weapon he had ever wielded. "Emily," he began, his voice low and unsteady. She remained silent, her profile calm but unreadable in the dim light. He pressed on, desperation giving him the strength to unravel himself. "I don't deserve the chance to stand here, not after what I did to you. I told myself for years that I was justified, that I had no choice, but the truth is that I was afraid. I was selfish. I let my pride dictate my life, and it cost me the only thing that ever mattered." The words tumbled out of him in a rush, sharper and more honest than he had ever been. He confessed to the nights when he had remembered her face, when guilt had gnawed at the edges of his mind but he buried it beneath work, power, and fleeting pleasures that meant nothing. He admitted that he had thought of her often, though never allowed himself to imagine the child that might exist because he had forced himself to believe there was no child at all. "I built walls around myself," he said, his hands tightening into fists, "and when you told me the truth, I panicked. I thought you would destroy the image I had worked so hard to create. I thought love was weakness. And so I destroyed us instead." At that, Emily finally turned, her eyes glinting in the muted light. Her voice was steady, but her words cut with precision. "You didn't just destroy us, Aaron. You destroyed her chance to have a father. You abandoned not me alone, but the child we created together. Do you have any idea what it means to sit awake at night wondering if you will ever be enough for someone who deserves more than the world can give? Do you know what it's like to watch her grow, to see her eyes mirror yours, and to pray she will never know the pain of the man who gave them to her?" He flinched, because the truth in her words was unbearable. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I can't know, because I wasn't there. And that will haunt me for the rest of my life. But I can try now. I can fight every day from this moment forward to be the father she deserves. I can't erase the years I failed her, Emily, but I can make sure she never feels abandoned again." Emily studied him carefully, searching for weakness, for insincerity, for the arrogant mask she had known so well. Instead she saw a man stripped bare, not the empire builder who thrived on control but a man on his knees without physically falling. The sincerity in his voice disarmed her, but she refused to let herself yield too quickly. Her scars were not the kind that vanished with apologies. "Words are easy," she said quietly. "You spoke words before, words that cut me down and left me to raise our daughter alone. Why should I believe you now? Why should I let you step into her life and risk her heart being broken the way you broke mine?" Aaron's throat tightened. He stepped closer, his movements careful, as if afraid she might retreat. "Because for once I am not asking for myself," he said. "I don't care if you never forgive me. I don't care if you despise me until the end of time. But please, Emily, let me know her. Let me show her that I am not the man I was 7 years ago. Don't punish her for my sins." His voice cracked on the last words, and for a moment silence fell between them like a heavy curtain. Emily's eyes softened, but not enough to forgive. She turned back to the window, her reflection merging with the glowing city lights. She remembered nights of exhaustion when Lily cried and she had no one to lean on. She remembered the bitterness that almost consumed her, and the resolve that had kept her moving forward. And now here he was, the man who had once condemned her, begging not for his pride but for his child. It was almost unbearable to hear, to see the sincerity in his face, because part of her heart, long buried, wanted to believe him. After a long pause, she spoke. "This isn't about us anymore. It's about her. If I let you into her life, it will be for her sake, not for yours. And if you fail her, Aaron, if you walk away again, I will never let you near her again. She will not suffer because of your weakness." Aaron nodded, his eyes damp, his chest heavy with both shame and hope. "I won't fail her," he whispered. "Not again." The music from the ballroom drifted faintly into the corridor, carrying with it the sound of laughter and clinking glasses. The world went on as though nothing had changed, but for Aaron and Emily, everything had shifted. In the quiet of that corridor, with the city glowing beyond the glass and the ghosts of their past between them, the possibility of redemption had been spoken aloud. Neither of them knew what the future would hold, but for the first time in 7 years, a door had opened instead of closing. The weeks that followed the charity ball unfolded with a strange intensity that neither Aaron nor Emily had expected. The confrontation in the corridor had not resolved the years of pain between them, but it had forced open a door that could no longer be closed. Aaron, who had built his life around schedules and power plays, found himself entering a world he did not understand, a world shaped by bedtime routines, school drop-offs, and the quiet rhythms of a child's laughter. At first, Emily allowed only small glimpses. He was permitted to visit in the afternoons, to sit at the small kitchen table in their apartment where the golden invitation had once glared at her like a wound. Lily regarded him with cautious curiosity at first, shy in his presence yet drawn to him in ways neither of them could ignore. The first time he helped her with homework, fumbling over crayons and math worksheets, Aaron realized how clumsy he was at the simplest things. He had faced billion-dollar deals without hesitation, but the innocent questions of a 6-year-old left him grasping for patience he had never needed before. When Lily asked him why the sky changed colors at sunset, he froze, ashamed that he had no answer ready, until Emily, watching from across the room, spoke softly to explain it. Aaron listened to both of them, struck by how much of life he had missed. Each moment reminded him that these were years that could never be returned, and the weight of that loss both crushed him and drove him to fight harder for every second he could have now. Slowly, Lily began to trust him. She invited him into her games, laughed at his clumsy attempts to braid her hair, and demanded his presence at the small milestones of her life. Aaron, who had always measured success in numbers and headlines, found himself treasuring drawings she made of the three of them together. Each crooked line, each misspelled word, was more valuable than the empire he had built. He began to see the world through her eyes, innocent, eager, and unscarred by the choices that had once destroyed him. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with love. Emily remained cautious, watching closely, never letting herself forget how easily he had abandoned her before. Yet she could not deny the change in him. He was no longer the cold man who had sneered at her vulnerability, he was raw, uncertain, and almost humble. She saw him arrive at her apartment without the entourage or arrogance that once defined him. He carried groceries, he listened, he showed up. Actions that once would have seemed trivial became proof of sincerity. And though her heart resisted, something inside her softened against her will. There were nights when Lily fell asleep on the couch after demanding a story from them both, and Emily would find herself sitting beside Aaron in the quiet, the only sound the gentle breathing of their daughter. In those moments, the distance between them seemed less insurmountable. They would speak in low voices, not of the past but of practical things, the school Lily might attend next year, the piano lessons she wanted to try, the small worries and hopes that made up a parent's world. Each conversation wove a thread between them, fragile yet undeniable, and Emily began to wonder if perhaps they were building something new, something beyond the ruins of what they had once been. Aaron knew better than to ask for forgiveness outright. Instead, he tried to earn it, day by day. He took Lily to the park, taught her to balance on a bicycle, and learned how to flip pancakes on Sunday mornings, laughing when he failed. Emily watched from the kitchen doorway, arms crossed, pretending not to smile, though inside she felt a warmth she had not allowed herself in years. Each small act chipped away at the walls she had built, not because he demanded it, but because he had finally understood what love required: humility, sacrifice, and presence. It was one evening in late spring when the change became undeniable. They sat in the garden behind Emily's building, lanterns swaying gently in the warm breeze. Lily had fallen asleep across both their laps, her head resting on her mother's shoulder, her small hand tangled in Aaron's fingers. The quiet was peaceful, filled only with the hum of the city beyond and the distant song of crickets. Emily looked down at her daughter, then at the man beside her, and felt the ache of 7 years of loneliness slowly begin to ease. She did not forgive everything in that instant, but she understood that forgiveness was not a single act, it was a journey, and perhaps they had finally begun it. Lily stirred in her sleep and murmured words that seemed too perfect to be real. "Mom, Dad, don't let go of each other." Her voice was soft, dreamlike, yet it pierced through the walls around Emily's heart. She met Aaron's eyes, and for the first time in years there was no hostility between them, only a fragile recognition of the bond they all shared. Aaron's gaze was steady, filled with regret but also with a quiet, desperate hope. And Emily, though her instincts urged caution, felt her hand tighten slightly around his beneath their daughter's. The night stretched on, gentle and full of possibility. The past would never disappear, but it no longer had the power to dictate their future. They had faced the ghosts that haunted them, and now, in the soft glow of lantern light, they began to imagine a different tomorrow. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to believe that their story was not over. It was not the same story they had started years ago, fractured by betrayal and abandonment, but a new one, born of pain yet shaped by the chance for redemption. And as she sat there with Aaron beside her and Lily sleeping peacefully between them, Emily realized that the family she had once thought impossible was slowly, quietly, becoming real.